Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to Preemie Chats. Preemie Chats is a program that is for healthcare professionals and parents to talk about what matters to you, to explore new ideas, and to learn together. I'm Leah Whitehead. I'm a mom of a preemie and a former journalist, and I'm happy to be your host today from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Preemie Chats was created and is put on by the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. It's also very well known as CPBF. The foundation is a parent-led charitable organization that helps families in and after NICU through education, advocacy, and support. If you have a heart for preemies, whether you're a family or a healthcare professional, please check out the CPBF website. I popped it up there on the screen, canadianpreemies.org. There you will find resources, the latest projects, and most importantly, a community of people who want to see our little babies thrive. Today's session is live, so please bring your voice to the table. Leave comments and questions in the chat, and we'll try to address them during today's program. It is through rich conversations like these where we can advance practice and learn together. So please participate, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Now on to today's topic, beyond the binary in birthing. How we can work together to move through systemic binary limitations. We're going to be joined in a moment by Jessy Dame, who will be presenting on this topic, discussing language and ways that healthcare providers can work with the community to ensure best care is provided to all who access health services. Jessy Dame is a very proud Two-Spirit Métis certified registered nurse. Jessy's family is from Treaty 1 and 2 territories, which is known today as Winnipeg and St Rose-du-lac. Jessy has worked within neonatal and postnatal health. He currently works within a queer sexual health clinic in downtown Vancouver. Jessy is the Indigenous sex and gender leader within the Indigenous Wellness team and the Two-Spirit program manager with the community-based research center. Through these roles, Jessy is able to work with and for the Two-Spirit community to create resources and advocate for services. Thank you for joining us today, Jessy.
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Very excited to be here today.
I'm going to put your presentation up, and then I will rejoin you after for some questions and answers.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Leah. So again, good morning, everybody. I'm very excited to be here on this call today to talk about some of the work that I get to do every day, as well as some of the roles and responsibilities for all of us in community and providing services. So I changed a little bit of the title just through conversations recently about building responsibility through relationality. So connecting together and challenging that internal ego to realize the responsibility that all of us have to ensure we're providing safe and comfortable healthcare. So quickly to acknowledge, I'm calling in today among the Coast Salish peoples, among the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So it's very important for me to ensure that I include land acknowledgement in all of my presentations, of course, to actively challenge and bring awareness to societal colonization and assimilation that is ongoing, and to ensure that we take a moment to connect ourselves to wherever we're situated across Turtle Island. And again, that responsibility we have to unpack some of these systemic issues. So thank you for having me, and thank you for being in this space with me today. So quickly on the agenda, I'll speak quickly to who I am, but Leah already introduced me, and then I'm going to talk to you about the concept of decolonization, the concept of binary, and then an Indigenous approach to sex and gender. And hopefully through that journey, we can challenge the systemic binary and then have some language-specific conversations after and questions. So just being clear that there's zero tolerance for discrimination, that respectful questions, so taking a moment to reflect on how we approach questions, this conversation, especially given the current state of the world, can be quite ego-driven for some folks. So just being aware that please, zero tolerance for discrimination, and if we're asking questions, to be respectful in the way that we approach the questions. That being said, that this is a moment for reflection and for us all to attempt to connect together to ensure we're providing the best care possible. So again, quickly, who am I? Proud Métis, two spirits. Both my parents are Métis, originally from Treaty 1 and Treaty 2, which we know as Winnipeg and St Rose-du-lac, and I'm a member of Métis Nation BC through my mom's family, the Dame and Brelands. First and foremost, I am a son, a partner, and a brother, and as Leah said, I am a certified registered nurse, so I've worked in the NICU since 2015, still casually there, as well as a queer sexual health clinic that I'm still able to work at while doing a few different, wearing a few different beautiful hats that work for the Two-Spirit community, the queer and trans Indigenous community specifically.
Jessy, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we're having a bit of a microphone problem that we didn't have before. It's just kind of fuzzy and echoey. Okay. I don't know how to fix it, but someone did comment that the sound is a little hard to understand. So I just wanted to make sure that we...
So it's still right now as I'm speaking, it's still choppy?
Yeah. And it's just when you're speaking, like it kind of echoes and...
Maybe
Thank you, Laura, for sharing that. I wondered if it was like my computer or if everyone could hear it like that. So...
Is that any better?
Oh, 100% better. Okay, sorry, I'll leave you to it now.
My apologies. I don't know. That's weird. We did a sound check prior, so my apologies for the sound issue. So I could just a quick summary, just introduce myself a little bit further, as well as just to hope to bring us on a journey together through a few different concepts to try and challenge some of the internal systemic binaries that we all kind of hold within us because of societal influence. So quickly, the concept of decolonization. I'm sure many of us are aware of this concept or have heard of decolonization, but what does it actually mean? So the concept of decolonization is about shifting the way Indigenous people view themselves and the way non-Indigenous people view Indigenous people. It's about Indigenous people reclaiming the family, community, culture, language, history, and traditions that were taken under the federal government policies designed for assimilation. Decolonization restores Indigenous worldviews. Decolonization restores culture and traditional ways. And decolonization replaces Western interpretations of history with Indigenous perspectives of history. And that's the part I really want to focus on. When we talk about decolonization, we're not just adding Indigenous content, we're actually replacing Western content and interpretations of history with Indigenous interpretations of history. So that's really directly tied into the conversation we're going to have in a moment about sex and gender and the legacy and long-standing inclusion of sex and gender in Indigenous histories. So a lot of times when we're talking about cultural safety or cultural humility work or decolonization, sex and gender is actually left out of the conversation. So I continuously advocate to ensure that we are including sex and gender in the conversations about decolonization and cultural safety, because we need to challenge the patriarchy. We need to challenge the systemic structures in place that limit sexual expression, gender expression, and we can do that through looking back through some of the Indigenous ways and interpretations of sex and gender, which we'll dive into in just a moment. I really like to highlight a few different examples about what does it mean in healthcare when we talk about decolonization. Is it creating space for Indigenous folks? Well, actually, through a decolonial lens, it's actually giving back the space, right? Because that space was taken. So it's a small shift in words, but it actually has a huge emphasis on what we're doing. Because creating space, we're working hard, we're creating space. Where in actuality, we should be giving that space back. A lot of times, are we increasing visibility? What does that look like? A lot of times we're seeing a lot of different plaques put in hospitals and totem poles risen, which is beautiful, but but are all the staff actually trained? Are all the staff aware of what that totem pole or what those plaques mean in those hospital settings or in the NICU, for example? So it's important to have things visible, but it's also important to go deeper than just specific items in places in the hospital, that all of our staff are trained and have access to continuous education. It's not a one-time piece. It's not a one-time training. It's continuous education. And unfortunately or fortunately, we do have a long way to go. We've seen some huge examples in the news over the last couple of years about systemic racism and discrimination that has resulted in death. So being clear that we all have a responsibility here to reflect and internally reflect on what decolonization means and how we do that. So more specifically, speaking to the concept of the binary, and then I'll weave the two concepts together. The binary is a very hot topic right now in the world. Simply put, it's as per the Webster Dictionary, a binary is consisting of indicating or involving two. In current society, the binary centers around all human beings being either a man or a woman, but being clear that this is a Western construct that was created purposefully to divide and disempower folks who do not fit the societal mold. We know now that throughout Turtle Island and the entire world, there are many communities, many communities, which I'll share in a moment, with many genders and gender expressions across the world. And even further, in many Indigenous languages and cultures throughout Turtle Island, gendered language actually does not exist. And in reality, it speaks to the roles and responsibilities of the community member rather than their genitals or where their genitals are going. We have a hyperfixation in society to focus on certain parts of people instead of the human, instead of the person in front of us, and listening to how they identify or how they're expressing themselves. So realizing that the binary in itself is a Western construct that must be challenged both internally and systemically to alleviate this pressure or this forced mold for every single person to identify, not just within the 2S LGBTQAI+ world, but for all folks outside of the queer realms as well, because this is a societal mold. Many of us remember the forced toys or the colors or the different things that we see that maybe we didn't want to play with, or the colors we didn't necessarily want to wear, but that's been ingrained in society for the last couple hundred years, and it's really important for us to reflect on how that influences our kids, how that influences our society, about these quote unquote stereotypical roles of still today of folks who identify within the spectrum of being a man or a woman. Even though we've come a long way, we do still see the forced binary and limitations that have resulted from this concept over the last 100 years or couple hundred years. So quickly, again, sex and gender. So a lot of times I like to cover just the quick concepts between the difference of sex and gender. I usually speak to sex and gender because I think in my world it is an inclusive way of speaking to sexuality, sexual health, sexual sex, as well as gender identity, gender expression, but being clear that sex and gender are very different. That a person's gender is how they identify internally and how they express themselves externally. People may use clothing, jewelry, and appearances and behaviors to express their gender that they identify with, which can include agender, gender fluid, gender queer. Folks may identify as a man, non-binary, or a woman. So gender identity is the term that refers to the personal sense of individual's own gender, and a sex is a person's sex is typically based on certain biological factors such as their reproductive organs, genes, and hormones. And I do hear a lot, well, there's only two sexes, but actually through a number of different presentations and a lot of the work that I've been able to do in this realm and conversations with biologists and some geneticists, there's actually 7 different forms of sexes and different chromosomal aspects of sex. So that in itself, our sex isn't binary. So even on a cellular level, we're not binary. So it's that realization that there is many different forms, a beautiful big spectrum of expression. And historically, this forced binary was forced upon us to limit that expression. Because on a cellular level, there is some biologists actually will even argue that there's more different chromosomes, that's chromosomal frames that are more than just XXY or XY or YY than 7, but the most recent publication was 7, as well as within the gender spectrum. There is anywhere from 7 to 9 to further gender expressions that have been documented throughout history, not just today, but throughout history, throughout the world. So noting that sex and gender are different, they may be connected, but they are different. So just quickly, the Indigenous approach to sex and gender is the two-spirit concept. So I'm sure many folks have heard about two-spirit recently. It is a concept that is not new, but the term two-spirit came to be in the early 90s. And this is where I'm talking about the decolonial approach, where I'm talking about unpacking some of our Western interpretations of history and replacing them with Indigenous interpretations of history. Because the concept in itself is very ambiguous and very large and very beautiful. It doesn't have an exact definition, which in healthcare, of course, we don't love, because we love definition. We love when we can clearly define things. But when we're talking about gender, when we're talking about gender expression, there is no clear definition because every single person is different. And that's what the beautiful part of it is. So when we're replacing this Western interpretation of the binary with an Indigenous approach in our brains and thinking about sex and gender, we're really talking about roles and responsibilities in community. What are folks doing in community versus their genitals and where they're putting them? So it's not limited to gender or sexual orientation within the two-spirit concept. It may be connected to someone's gender or sexual orientation, but again, it was about the role in community, connecting the way that folks act, the way that folks express themselves, but also the roles that they may exhibit in community, which I'll speak to in the next slide. So what I asked today is to...
I'm sorry, Jessy, to interrupt again, but the sound is doing that thing again. It was perfectly clear for a chunk of time there, and then just started to...
Okay. Is that...
Fabiana thought maybe disconnect your headphones and reconnect, or
I can try and just do it. Just
again, that's crystal clear again. So I don't want to keep interrupting you, but I also want to make sure we can hear what you're saying. So sorry.
No, it's okay. This is the beauty of being live, I guess.
I know. Technology.
But we tested it all out too, so I don't know, but I'll just stay. So
thank you.
I'll quickly. Unfortunately, I am aware of the time limitations now because of these number of hiccups. So I'll try and go quickly, and then I would like to have more time for questions and further explanation, because I know I've had to go through these things quite fast. But the journey I was attempting to bring you on was just that realization of what decolonization is, that the binary is a Western interpretation, and how can we replace the binary with a different perspective, a different approach towards sex and gender, and how is it all of our responsibility and actually freeing for everybody? It's not just about certain groups of people or certain communities. It actually will benefit everybody by removing the binary limitations. And I'll give you some specific examples that I've experienced in our NICU settings in labor and delivery in a moment. But the goal of this slide and the Indigenous approach to sex and gender, I see the slide's a little bit condensed, but is to really realize that historically there were other concepts and other ways for folks to express themselves that were a normal part of society, that were connected to society without limitations for folks to express themselves. And again, it was about their role and responsibility in community versus the current limitations of the binary. So historically, the term before the 1492, there was many different terms. I told you that the term in itself is young, but the concept is quite old. There was many different terms for two-spirit people across Turtle Island. And then from 1942 to 1990, a medical term berdache was used, which is a very homophobic and derogatory term, but we can still find it in medical journals today and folks quoting today. So I think I like to highlight this word, even though it is a very problematic and very discriminatory word, just to note that until the 90s, when many of us likely were born, this term was used regularly in healthcare to describe queer, trans, and non-binary two-spirit or Indigenous people. And it's the definition I won't give you now, but you can look it up, is super problematic. So it's just an interesting perspective of how harmful a language is and how long it can take for us to change language. So in 1990, there was a gathering in Manitoba And an elder came forward with the term two-spirit to have this concept to change the narrative and take back the narrative of two-spirit people, and that it's not limited to sexual orientation or gender, but it is an expression of being and responsibilities in community. So historically, two-spirit folks were mediators, matchmakers, social workers, name givers, Sundance people. They participated in puberty ceremonies, peacemakers, joined war parties, were doctors or medicine people. So today we do see a lot of two-spirit folks through the Indigenous lens, being clear that two-spirit is an Indigenous specific term for Indigenous folks, but the concept and the growth beyond the binary is an understanding for all folks. So we do see a lot of two-spirit people in roles of advocacy, healthcare, taking care of ceremony in their own communities, because again, it's about that role and responsibility. It's not just about your sexual orientation or your gender. As I said before, that this is not a unique concept to Canada or to Turtle Island. It's actually a concept that's throughout the world. There are many countries throughout the world that have a third, a fourth, a fifth, or a sixth gender, or a gender analysis more than an actual gender. And it's very important in community to understand that it's more about, it's not a specific mold that we fit in. It challenges those perspectives, and it varies, which is the beautiful aspect of the concept in itself. So sorry, I usually like to just be aware for folks. The next image I like to share is an image of the first residential school in Pennsylvania. So just for folks who are on the call who are going to see the next slide, it is an image of the children at the first residential school from the late 1800s. I share this image in honor of the children that we lost in the residential school system, as well as the survivors, and just want to clearly identify how deeply rooted the binary is within the systems that we live in. So this image has everything to do with two-spirit people, but has nothing to do with two-spirit people. It has nothing to do with two-spirit people, because as you can see, the front row are quote unquote little girls wearing dresses with longer hair, and the back row are little boys with short hair and button-ups. So it has nothing to do with two-spirit people because the binary is here. It has everything to do with two-spirit people because we are in this picture. We were just erased through the system. So realizing that when we're talking about decolonization, when we're talking about cultural safety, when we're talking about cultural humility, that sex and gender is important because it was deeply rooted in the residential school system and in colonization to eliminate and erase two-spirit, queer, and trans Indigenous folks, as well as all folks. It greatly limits. So just being clear that through the residential school system, it was also further super harmful to sex, sexual health, sexual stigma, sexual shame. So reinforcing that harmful narrative about sexuality. So I really like to highlight this image to ensure that folks are aware when we're talking about the legacy of the residential school system, but also harm within our own country, that sex and gender was greatly influenced. And unfortunately, a lot of times that part of the conversation is left out. So why we're here today, that was supposed to be a very quick journey for all of us, but I apologize that it took us much longer. So language matters. And I don't know what's going on with my slides. I don't love that the E is hanging out by itself, but that's fine. Language matters. So today, the goal of that conversation is just the first part of the conversation is just to unpack some of the internal stuff, as well as maybe flip the light switch on about some of the things we see in society or in our own work sites, and how important it is for us to unpack some of the forced binary that is on people, and that how important our language is when we interact with people, but also our charting or anything is extremely important. So of course, many of us work in the worlds of birthing. Birthing is a very genderized area. And the goal of this conversation is not to take away from anybody's experience, but rather add to the experience of all folks who birth. So when we're talking about language, it's really important. A topic that's been coming up more lately is additive language. So we're saying women and other people who birth, or women and others. And I like to acknowledge that it's an attempt to be inclusive, but it's actually the exact opposite and causing further othering, because we're still centering one gender over another. So instead, or alternatively, what do we do to challenge that perspective of this quote unquote norm? We create an opportunity for all folks to identify and then follow that pathway. So if somebody does identify as a woman in birthing, great. If somebody doesn't, they identify as a man within birthing, great. So it's just this realization of creating an avenue or a space for all folks to identify, starting in a neutral level, and then moving forward, so that we don't have any situations where we accidentally assume or interact with folks and cause harm. Because the goal for all of us, especially in the NICU, is just to provide an environment where the newborn can connect with the new parent, and not to further stigmatize or challenge their interactions through their new birth. So really realizing and normalizing this aspect of gender neutral language, or creating an avenue for folks to identify. And it doesn't need to be complex. We don't need to be experts in all areas of language to be able to have these conversations. Utilizing our pronouns when we introduce ourselves with the patient can open an avenue for us to show that we are self-aware of our own gender, self-aware of our own situatedness, and then it allows opportunity for our patients to potentially identify themselves, as well as coming at it from a neutral language. Another example is partners. We are seeing a lot of queer families with a lot of unfortunate situations in our NICUs and in our labor and deliveries about assumptions about partners or how babies were conceived. And we know today that there are many different ways about how a baby can be conceived. So just realizing and unpacking some of the language that has become normal within our settings to ensure that we're coming from a neutral standpoint, to allow all folks to identify, to create the most welcoming and kind space for everybody who is within our care. Because as I said, what is our goal? It's to create a space for all folks to identify and normalize this care, so that we can work together to challenge the systemic binary that forces and limits all of us from expressing ourselves to who we are. Since we were young to when we were older, there's been limitations on how we express ourselves and how we see ourselves in the news or in movies. So it's just that realization of a lot of that is deeper than just assumptions. It's systemic. So how do we challenge that and unpack that, and then replace it with a space for all of us just to openly share. And that's where I want to connect back to the start of the presentation, is that responsibility through relationality, that this isn't about one person versus another. This is about all of us, that we all have a responsibility to connect through relationally, and to challenge the ego when we're talking about, especially around birthing, to ensure that all folks who give birth have a space where they feel comfortable. So I want to make sure that there is a moment for questions, because I know we're way over time because of a couple different hiccups, but noting that I do have a couple different examples of recent situations that I can share if folks are interested, but I would love to pass it back if there's any questions first, and then if there's another minute, I'm happy to share the examples of some situations that are in our healthcare system that we can kind of unpack a little bit.
I think it would be great for you to share some examples. And if people have questions, please put them in the chat, and then we'll address those. But yeah, I'd say carry on. I mean, we're good for time, especially in light of the technology difficulties we were having. But yeah, carry on. I think it's great.
Perfect. So I like to just always connect it back to maybe some of the experiences that folks have had in the NICU or in labor and delivery, just to really try and center or focus our attention on maybe some examples that we've witnessed or that you've seen, to how can we challenge it. So the first example that happens and that we have witnessed in some of the hospitals here is the genderized wristbands. So some hospitals still continue to have mother, father, baby one, baby two wristbands. So of course that is a perfect example of how entrenched the system is in the binary, the assumptions about mother, father. Outside of the queer realm, how many parents are coming in that aren't necessarily the father is very aware. People bring in a lot of different partners or a lot of different support folks. So being aware that those wristbands should be replaced or should be challenged to ensure that we're inclusive of all folks, so that nobody's having to wear wristbands or labels that aren't theirs. And having conversations about language. I think a big example that happens typically in BC is the renaming of some of our hospitals. There's a lot of genderized language when it comes to birthing, as we all are aware, and as I said, it's not about removing or completely or erasing folks' experiences. It's about providing an opportunity for all folks. So, for example, BC Women's Hospital. So it is within the name is genderized, and if we want to change that name, that is one thing. But my biggest concern is that when we are expressing ourselves as the top hospital in the province, then we best have pathways for all folks who birth. And unfortunately, we don't. So renaming and changing the names of pieces is extremely important, as well as having pathways to support folks. So we don't have pathways in all of our hospitals to support all folks who birth. When they come in, they're hit instantly with limitations or expressions or assumptions from our healthcare providers. So it's really important for us to be aware of our own assumptions. We've had many different experiences where there's either a trans man coming in to deliver, and our nurses or our healthcare providers are very intrusive about how that happened, how the person got pregnant, do they have to go on hormones or off hormones, and just being aware of the situations that we may now experience in our settings, to not be overcritical or over-examining, to ensure that all folks are feeling welcome in these spaces, and that we should be creating opportunities and pathways for all folks to birth, with materials, pamphlets, pathways that are supportive of their gender expression or gender identity. And the last one I want to I really like to reinforce is an experience of a coworker of mine historically who gave birth in our own hospital. Actually, her and her wife delivered, and it was a great delivery. Day one, baby was in the room with both moms, the birther and the mom, and it was a great experience. The birther stayed in the hospital with the baby. The second mom went home. Later that evening, and a healthcare provider was like, "Oh, where's dad? Where's dad?" The birther acknowledged, "My wife is at home. She has to work tomorrow. She'll be back tomorrow." So that nurse okay, leaves. The next morning, another nurse comes in. "Where's dad? Where's dad? Where's dad?" The patient again corrects the nurse. "Hey, my wife is at work today. She'll be back tomorrow." That third day, the same thing happens in the morning, to the point where the patient now just says, "Dad's at work," and throws it up. And I really like to reflect on that story about how over a few days of continuous assumptions or continuous misgenderings or pieces, I think it's really important for us to reflect that it's not just my role, it's all of our role to pass on the information, but also ensure that none of us are being assumptive, because one situation, fine, but after 3 days, it can be extremely draining, as well as we know what happens on day 2 and day 3 after giving birth. We got cluster feeding, we got many things going on. So when we have all of these other situations, plus assumptions, plus mispronouns, and plus things, it really strips away some of the potential relationship bonding with healthcare providers, but also with the newborn. So just being clear that it is exhausting for everybody involved in that moment, and then adding in assumptions and situations where the patient feels uncomfortable is quite harmful. So just being aware that if we come from a place of neutrality, we're able to provide opportunity for folks to identify themselves and support each other in different ways. And yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Leah.
Yeah, thanks, Jessy. That was great to give some practical examples. And I think, like, even the idea, you mentioned it briefly, of charting, and that kind of passing on that information so that people aren't, I know as a mom in NICU, even being asked the same questions over and over was frustrating. I'd be like, yes, I've been here for X amount of days. I know how to do that. But it's that, like,
and then add in the assumptives that maybe they're calling you the wrong name every day. It's
right.
a very heightened, very stressful place for healthcare providers, as nurses in the NICU, as well as the parents, because all I want to do is make sure that you're in control of that situation and that you feel supported with your newborn. And if we had situations of stress and language, then it's like a whole nother level.
We do have a couple questions here. Fabiana asked, is it okay for a healthcare provider to ask how parents want to be addressed?
Yes, I strongly suggest absolutely. I would either ask pronouns, or if folks don't know or are uncomfortable, just asking if there's any specific language that the parent would like or wouldn't like in their care. We know that outside of the queer setting, there are like certain language for folks who either survive sexual assault or other different forms of abuse, that there is words or language that we may use normally in a labor and delivery setting or a NICU setting that may be harmful. So again, starting from that place of neutrality, saying, hey, is there any language or any words that you would prefer in your care or out of your care? If the person says no, then that's great. But if the person also says these words, that's also great, because then you can identify certain words that they would prefer outside of their, like excluded from their care. And then, I mean, simply by addressing yourself and including your pronouns, it provides an opportunity for folks to also provide theirs.
We had a comment from Laura that just said that she's happy to say that our mother-baby unit has been renamed postpartum care unit. And I think that's speaking to your comment about BC Women's Health.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just that again, the genderized language that is we often see in hospitals and elsewhere.
Totally. And it's also the realization that like a lot of other things happen on our units too, right? So it's like, it's not just, it's that realization that there are many different opportunities. And when we label it as a gender specific space, it creates awkwardness for many people, because there's assumptions from healthcare providers and assumptions from other patients. And then when we're both policing that singular patient, it can cause a lot of harm. And that does happen, especially for trans men when they're going in to give birth, which we are seeing more and more common. It's a dynamic that we need to be able to address as healthcare providers, as well as in the spaces.
And then Fabiana had another question too. How can we, she's the executive director of Canadian Premature Baby Foundation. So how can we, a parent organization like CPBF, play a role in this area, working with parents and healthcare providers?
Yeah, normalizing these conversations. I think if we're willing to ask somebody's full name and birth date in front of patients, we can ask their pronouns. If we're willing to ask information that can get you my credit card, then we can normalize these conversations about pronouns, and situating yourself in that space, I think is extremely important. And that there are many folks who birth, and regardless of societal norms, that we need to challenge that perspective and just provide opportunity for everybody who gives birth to create that space. And again, it's about ensuring that there are pathways. Whether we remove all genderized language or not, that's a different category, and with my own opinions, but we need to at least have pathways that support all folks. So we need to ensure that we have we need to see other folks who give birth in these spaces as well, not just certain genders over others.
And can you help out? So I am not a healthcare professional. So when you say pathways, is that protocols?
I would say both. So protocols and policies, also just overall pathways to care. Like a lot of times when you go into the NICU, you get pamphlets and different things about like how to access this or how to do that. And they're very genderized. So which is okay if that's the gender you identify in, but then we better have other pamphlets and other information and pathways to support other folks who also need support, who statistically we know probably are more likely to end up in the NICU, right? We know that trans parents and queer parents are up to 3 times more likely to end up in the NICU. So that's a pretty important stat that I glossed over, because this is our responsibility. So thank you for triggering that, Leah. It is our responsibility, because we will, as NICU nurses and as healthcare providers in preemie areas, will be interacting with trans patients, queer parents, because they're more likely, because of systemic issues, because of the social determinants of health, to end up in our nurseries. So we need to ensure that when folks come into our spaces, that we have images, but also pamphlets and other things that are inclusive of all folks who can give birth.
One of the neonatologists in our unit, I know that he was in a meeting and we were having this discussion, and he was very vulnerable and candid and said that one thing that he struggled with personally was he was always afraid to make a mistake with his language. And so what kind of advice would you have for those healthcare providers who really want to be inclusive, but at the same time, maybe they don't have that knowledge? And so that's where he was coming from, that he was feeling afraid.
Please make the mistake, because it shows us that you're trying, that you're trying to grow and adapt with the current society and grow with all of us who are in those spaces, because it's making the mistake, being corrected and moving forward, rather than continuously making the mistake or just completely staying away from it. And we are seeing that is happening. It's like, well, it's unsafe, so I'm just not even going to touch that. which actually is even more unsafe, right? So it's making the mistakes and being okay and being vulnerable to the mistakes and to correcting. Critical, I mean, as healthcare providers, we are all about critical reflection and critical feedback, right? So it's these moments of where we, again, release the ego and more realize the responsibility that we have to try and make change, because that's where a lot of this unfortunately gets lost in, is this ego battle between like, well, you're right, I'm right, we're both, and it's not about being right necessarily. It's about creating spaces for all folks to feel comfortable to give birth and ensuring that relationship between that newborn and that new parent is as comfortable as possible. Because as you know, it's not the most comfortable setting, even on a great day when everything is perfect.
Right. So. Yeah. Laura just affirmed what you said there. She said the fact that they care about making a mistake shows allyship and support.
Totally.
And I appreciate that, because I know that was the kind of heart of that comment that he made in the meeting. And that's good to say that, mistakes are okay to make and that we all make them as well.
Oh, it's a fast changing environment, right? And that's where I always stress is like, we don't need to be experts to have these conversations. We don't need to be to work every single day and be like studying every single day. It's the attempt and trying and being aware that we will continue to grow. Things will continue to change. The language that I use today might not be appropriate or might change drastically in 2 months from now. And that's great. That means we're evolving. That means we're changing. So not being scared to make a mistake, as well as being open to the changes that continuously come, and not seeing it as a hassle, because it's not a hassle. It's powerful to see the reclamation of people taking control of their own self after hundreds of years of the system telling us to be certain ways. And if we can view it as that way, then we can see how powerful it could become for all of us to be able to express ourselves in that way.
Well, thank you. I think that is a great note to finish on today. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Jessy. I'm sorry that your audio wasn't working well during that present. I felt terrible to keep interrupting you, but I did want to make sure that you were able to continue. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And I apologize for the breaks and the interruptions because of that. But thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for engaging in the discussion and for joining us here today. We also want to thank our sponsor, AstraZeneca, for their ongoing support of our educational program. And just a reminder that if you missed part of today's session, then you can head over to CanadianPreemies.org, and there you will see this full episode as well as previous editions of Preemie Chats. You'll find many resources and support options available there, and you'll be reminded that CPBF is a charitable organization, and it depends on support to continue its important work. Consider how you can support CPBF and its mission to empower families of premature babies in every step of their journey. Together, we can create a brighter future for all preemies and their families. I hope that you'll be able to join us here next Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for Enhancing FICARE, Family Integrated Care, with secure video technology in the NICU. Insights will include how we can leverage the universal use of smartphones to keep families connected on their NICU journey. I hope you're able to join us for that.